So glad that some of you were able to come out tonight. This was my only my second trip away from home since the pandemic started, and I love my 3 children, but I haven't been asked to make a snack or find a computer plug like in 3 whole days, which is actually feels kind of miraculous. So. And great to be back here at Frazer. The only other time I was here was to officiate the wedding of my best friend Gwen. And so Gwen, you might be on Zoom tonight. So such a joy to be back in the pulpit here tonight. Let's just pray again, shall we? Okay. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So I wanted to start out tonight by telling you a little bit about the experience that I have going into my church building every day. Raleigh Mennonite doesn't own a building, so we rent space from this big Episcopal church downtown, and right kind of cat-a-corner from our church building is a place called Capitol Square. It's this big green space with this granite building in the middle, and it is the oldest district in Raleigh, which is cooler if you're not from Pennsylvania, where stuff is probably older than in North Carolina. But and this is also happens to be a place where a lot of over centuries, a lot of civic conflict has worked itself out in our state. So it's a state capital. And so when I walk either in or out of my church, I am confronted with this space that represents conflict and anger and unrest. And I especially think about that space and what it has represented over the past 2 years. So this is sort of the geography of what this space looks like. So when I come out and I look out on the left, I see the place along the sidewalk where for weeks protesters gathered to falsely declare that Donald Trump had won a second term, literally for weeks. And in the front center, there's this bare patch of grass where a Confederate monument was torn down by protesters during the George Floyd protest. And on the right, every day, there are 2 men with signs who stand outside the congressional office building who declare that my children should not be wearing masks in schools. And right in the center is the place where just last week, I organized 50 middle schoolers for a protest of our lieutenant governor who called LGBTQ people filth and demonic. So that's what I see every time I walk in or out of my building is this space. And there's really something about the contrast here of our church being right here and all of this happening here, because this should have something to do with this, right? This out here should have something to do with this, but what? What we hope happens is that something is justice and unity and hope and love. But often the problem is that the same people out here are the people in here. And sometimes they're all together in here. But either way, there's no real separation. And I can sense that the church is straining under this weight. So what are we to do about this and this? I'll be honest that sometimes that feels like a hopeless question with no real good answer. As we do as Mennonites, it seems like the person who we ought to turn to is Jesus. So I want to take us to a place where I wonder if Jesus can help us to figure out what's the relationship between here and here. And the scripture I want us to focus on is this time when Jesus descends from a high place and sees these crowds out before him, and he's speaking, and these people are in need. The Bible says that in Luke that they have come with their sick and those who are demon possessed. They are reaching out to Jesus, this idea of these hands reaching out. And then Jesus shifts his gaze from the crowds and looks his disciples in the eye, and he divides up the world. Blessed are you who are poor, who are hungry, who weep when people hate you. You probably know that list really well because it comes up in the Gospel of Matthew as the Sermon on the Mount. All that sounds really good so far, but Luke goes on. Woe to you who are rich, for you have received consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Poor and rich, hungry and full, weeping and laughter, respected, reviled. And then Jesus gives them instructions about a form of life for you who listen. He talks to this group, the you who listen, and we can hear who those people are woven into the instructions that he gives them. These are people who have enemies. People hate them. People with power over them strike them on the face, and so they have to turn the other cheek. Jesus tells them that these are the people who beg for food and others who take from them without returning what they've taken. In other words, Jesus is describing the people he just said are blessed. The people who live under the shadow of the oppressive, coercive power of the Roman regime. These are the people who are going to follow Jesus. These are the people for whom Jesus' words are good news, to whom Jesus is offering this new kind of life. That life will move from the destitute and broken, from these cycles of violence and retribution, because nothing is healed in retribution. Nothing is made whole in vengeance. We cannot build the world we long for on violence and retribution, because only love can do that. That's what Jesus says. Only love can do that. I don't know if this is your experience, but for me, love is one of the slipperiest words that Christians use. One of the slipperiest. There is a woman in my congregation who stayed in an abusive marriage for decades because she was told that that's what it means to love. I've seen love cited as the reason not to confront harmful or destructive behavior. That's not how we show love. Herbert McCabe, one of my favorite theologians, a Dominican friar, he warned us of love's power to dull and silence. He wrote, "The gospel of love can safely be preached to bosses, for to them it will just mean philanthropy and soup for the deserving poor. And it can be profitably preached to the workers, for it will emasculate their struggle and induce them to bear their fate with Christian resignation." McCabe is thinking of his own situation of the English worker struggle. But we can sense the same danger here within the racially formed social order of the United States. The gospel of love is and has been safe for slavers and investment bankers and bosses. And it continues to be safe when it slides past urban gentrification and food apartheid into soup kitchens and calls for unity. It is so easy to reduce love to a sentiment or feeling or getting along or something like personal transformation. I think there's a part of all of us that wants Jesus to be nice and who helps us to be nice to others. But it never looks like that in the Bible. Jesus very rarely helps people actually get along. Regardless of their worth or their potential, this has so little to do with the Jesus we meet in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke 6, Jesus tells us what love is. He actually gives the definition of love as he's telling us the story. Have you ever noticed that in 10 verses, Jesus mentions giving away stuff 4 different times? 4 different times. Lending without return, and giving away. 4 times. It's almost like Jesus wants us to pay attention to that. Because love is concrete. Love is material. It looks like stuff. And it's this love that draws together this very shady, sort of lukewarm group of guys who jump into following Jesus and travel around with him throughout Judea. We know that following Jesus is not dependent upon understanding Jesus' teachings or being perfect, because the disciples are actually a hot mess. But they do have this in common. Despite fighting with each other and trying to figure out who is the most awesome among them, they do have this in common. They all leave their lives behind. Every one of them leaves their job. Every one of them leaves their family. Every one of them leaves behind whatever role they've taken up in this grinding gears of the empire's economics, whether that's on the side of destitution or thriving. And then they live off the generosity of one another and the people to whom they're sent. That's a gospel we can hold in our hands. We can actually feel the weight of it. It's solid. I recently learned that one of my alma maters, named Duke University, is organizing an alumni convocation that I will not be going to, entitled Uncommon Ground, Living with Humility, Patience, and Tolerance in a Divided Age. I have no doubt that they are responding to the massive breaks in churches that have developed during the Trump administration and have only been exacerbated by COVID-19. But I'm wary because there is an assumption in conferences like this one, in sermon series about unity, in books written to help pastors like me through times of division. And that assumption is that our divisions are not as significant as how we handle them. The real problem in our time is not the death of Black and brown people at the hands of police. It isn't partisan denial of climate catastrophe. It isn't an economy built on the backs of low-wage and undocumentable workers. The problem is division, one that can be addressed if we attend to it with humility and patience and tolerance. It's easy to get fooled by this because we live in a world that wants to divide us up into partisan categories of left, right, and center. We use these fictive boundaries to organize our difference because this language that helpfully is one that helpfully buries our material ideologies. Willie Jennings explains that for this reason, this way of describing our political lives is actually a deception. Jennings says we are put on a fictitious journey Because all three positions, left, right, and center, and anything between, are public fictions. They are public fictions. I think we like to use this language to talk about how to organize difference, because we don't want to talk about what's beneath the surface, because who really wants to know what's down there? We use this language because we prefer to hide behind political constructs that can absorb this vagueness. It's less cumbersome than getting into the details to find out what lies at the root. I think you all know that in our tradition of the Mennonite church, we often talk about how Jesus calls us to an alternative kingdom, right? We are neither Republicans or Democrats. We recognize the failure of both parties massively to enact the reign of God's love. We are a people of Jesus politics, and that is a politics of love. All of that is true, every word of it. But that also means that we participate in a form of life that is neither compromise or apolitical. Instead, the people who follow Jesus will create this material form of life that actually exceeds the most revolutionary impulses of the first century. I don't think there's any doubt reading the Gospels that Jesus longs for the liberation of the Jewish people from the Roman Empire. Jesus doesn't put himself as a mediator between Rome and the Jewish people. He doesn't try to reconcile them. Jesus has this revolutionary spirit in the same way as the Zealots. Jesus is in opposition to the social and economic outworkings of Rome. But those who would overthrow the government with blood and the sword, they do not go far enough. Because Jesus doesn't need a violent revolution, because the reign of God has come. Jesus doesn't need a sword because his life is the life of God, multiplying in good news and those around him. Jesus doesn't want to swap out one regime for another. Jesus wants to put an end to all empires that rise and fall and rise and fall. Remarkably, Jesus offers us a politics that will save both those who create the gears of economic tyranny and those who are crushed by them. Here is this shocking thing that Jesus says at the end of the Sermon on the Plain. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting anything in return. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. God is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. That sounds a little strange in light of the fact that Jesus was just pronouncing woe on the rich people. That doesn't sound very gracious, does it? I wonder if a translation that may get us closer to kind of holding these things together is, instead of kind, better. God is better to the ungrateful and wicked than they are to themselves. And that's because the blessing and woes of the Beatitudes are not prescriptions, they're actually descriptions of life. Jesus is just describing the kind of life that we already choose. A life where others are hungry while we are full, that's a bad life. A life where others weep and we laugh, that's a bad life. A life where others are persecuted or harmed or bullied while we enjoy respect, that is a bad life. And how do we respond when we've carved out a different way of being in the reign of God? We give to people without placing them in debt. Part of what we can keep in mind as we read about this series of 4 times about giving without expecting in return is that Jesus lives in this time that is where everyone is locked into this suffocating web of obligation. It's a system called the patron-client relationship, and it organizes every area of life in the first century. You only gave out a gift if it could be exchanged for an obligation from a lower class person, if you could put them in your debt. And the greatest benefactor in the society is Caesar. Jesus turns the tables and he says, God is the benefactor, the only benefactor. And God is someone who gives rewards without expecting anything in return. That's who God is. The absence of this obligation from gift, it would sabotage the economics of their day. And we give this way because we echo back God's love for the world. And that is a love without obligation. This is a system of collapsing friends and enemies, of patrons and clients, of givers and debtors. It's not determined by mutual respect or understanding, but through the inversion of economic relations as we know them. Friends, there are eruptions of this kind of reworking of social economies all around us. People gather money to bail poor people out of jail. There are churches that create circles to help pay off people's debts. A few years ago, members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America began this gathering money for this reparation fund for a man named Jehu Jones. Reverend Jones pastored the Lutheran Church, and he was never paid because he was a Black man. And so in 2019, a group of Lutherans raised the equivalent of his salary from 1830, what today would be $32,000 a year. And a group of Black pastors has decided how to redistribute those funds to other Black pastors who may not have enough to retire or who have been underpaid because of where they've chosen to serve. Their goal is eventually to build a reparation fund of $32 million. Jesus doesn't promise an end of conflict. And actually, it turns out most of the time the opposite is true. Jesus doesn't promise us that we'll be removed from the difficult and painful concerns of this world. Instead, we're more likely to find ourselves propelled into the muck and messiness of human life, even more as followers of Jesus. And when we're there, we're given the tools of love. We're given concrete love that feels like something. That's the sort of thing you can hold in your hand, that you can use to build a new world. That's not going to help people get along or draw people together across an ideological divide. But what it will do is make the world new. And if you plan to put your life down here among that beloved community, then here is Jesus' word. Blessed are you.